there's been debates within the kind of communist movement and stuff as to whether this was real communism. People look at what Karl Marx was saying. He was advocating for a dictatorship of the proletariat. He was advocating for class conflict. He was advocating for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Now, if you're advocating for a violent revolution and you end up taking control of a country, you're seizing the means of production. How do you go about doing that if people do not voluntarily give up their private property? It necessitates you having to use force. If we have the full apparatus of the state in a dictatorship where there is no free speech, there are no free elections, there's no free press. If we have a situation like that, we have the full force of the military and the secret police and everything. Surely the logical conclusion of that is that anyone who dissents, anyone who stands in the way of setting up your utopia has to be crushed. So when we talk about 20 million dead in the Soviet Union, 50 million dead in Maoist China, and millions more dead in all the other communist places, we have to really ask ourselves, at what point is the theory lined up with the reality? Because if in theory you're advocating for revolution, for violent revolution, surely the final outcome, and every single place it's been tried, it's had the same outcome. Surely the two things must be intertwined. Surely it can't be just coincidence that every single time they try to do communism, it's always ended up being perverted by people. Surely we have to pay the devil his due, and let's take them at their word, right? Let's say that they're trying to implement communism, so they're going by it in the same means. For those who argue that actually it could be implemented in different ways, chances are it's like what Lord Acton said about power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The inherent problem with having any sort of dictatorship, whether it's the proletariat or the bourgeoisie or whoever it is, is that you have too much power concentrated in the hands of too few people. And even if your intentions are good, very quickly someone with nefarious intentions, someone with ill intent is going to rise up to the top. So even if we assume that Lenin or Trotsky were angels, and there's no evidence to suggest they were, the Gulag system began under them. So even if we assume that they were complete angels, once you have all that power concentrated in the hands of so few people, it's going to be inevitable that the most ruthless person is going to rise to the top of that and is going to make the most of the system that you've created. When we talk about was it real communism or is it not real communism, we have to really ask ourselves, what would real communism actually look like, and how would you actually go about doing it in a way that's non-coercive? If you have a kulak, if you have like a wealthy peasant who says, no, you're not taking my land, you're not going to collectivise my land, you're not taking my money, you're not doing that, how are you going to deal with him other than throwing him in a gulag? How are you going to deal with him other than rounding him up and shooting him? How would any of this have happened in any other way? And I'd be very interested in the comment section to hear what people suggest was the alternative in their utopian analysis of this. But we do have to pay the devil his due. During Soviet times, during communist times rather, in all the different places where it was tried, we saw a lot of money going into education, into healthcare, into housing, into employment for people who, up until that point, had just been illiterate peasants living hand to mouth. At bare minimum, what we can say is that actually life for ordinary people in communist societies were, in some ways, better than life had been before these things. And also, let's not forget that most places that have had communism, in fact, nearly all places that have communism, have all been dictatorships before they were communists, right? With very, very few exceptions. So if all you've known is tyranny, if all you've known is poverty, or if all you've known is illiteracy and lack of access to healthcare and lack of housing, etc., and all of a sudden now at least you have the bare necessities in life taken care of, then it's quite easy to see why many people who come from places like Cuba or come from like the former Soviet Union, etc., how many of them will still say, you know what, things were bad, but at least we had this and that and that and that. Whereas now we don't have that. Part of the dynamic with communism is that from an economic standpoint, if everything is centralized within the state, the amount of like efficiency really does begin to like decrease over time, because there's no incentive for people to work harder if they're not going to get paid any extra. If there's no, like, if you're running a factory and you're only getting paid a little tiny bit more than the people working on the factory floor, then why go through the effort of trying to innovate? Well, you're not going to become a millionaire, you're not going to become a billionaire. Innovation ends up being stifled. The entire economy slowly decays and begins to stagnate. And so this is what you start to see in the Soviet bloc in the 70s and 80s. This culminates in 1989 to 91 with the collapse of, first of all, of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, with country after country like freeing themselves from Soviet domination, and then in 1991 the collapse of the USSR. There are still countries today which are on paper communist, right? But China, for instance, is still run in theory by the Chinese by communism, even though they've adopted free market economics. The same thing can be said for Vietnam. Again, the Communist Party there also still runs things, but has adopted capitalist economic models. So the only two places that have maintained a certain level of this communist economic policy are North Korea and Cuba. So if we compare what life has been like in South Korea with what is in North Korea, it's a stark difference. People in South Korea earn way more than people in North Korea. Cuba over the last 60 years has lost 1 million people fleeing to the United States, right? A little rubber dinghy rapids. I said rubber dinghy rapids. I got that from Four Lions. Wow, rubber dinghy rapids. Anyway, on little rubber dinghies. There's no rubber dinghy rapids yet. If you haven't seen Four Lions, go watch it. Yeah, like that's what I got in my head. But on little rubber dinghies, right? Crossing 90 miles of shark-infested waters, yeah, in order to get a better life. People flee communist countries for capitalist countries. People do not flee capitalist countries to go to communist countries. If you're losing almost 10% of your population to like this exodus to a capitalist country, right? How good is your system? And yes, people in Cuba do have excellent access to healthcare. But at the same time, if you're a doctor in Cuba, you make more money moonlighting as a taxi driver or as a doorman than you do from your actual profession. So yes, they've got more doctors per capita than any other place on earth. But even still, in Cuba, things are obviously not great if so many people are leaving. And also, what we have to really think about is this. Why would it be necessarily beneficial to live under a communist society? Why would it be necessarily be good to have everything exactly equal? Because we all know that people have different talents, that people strive to do different things, right? And some of those things take extra time, take extra levels of skill, doing things that other people cannot do, like whether it being an athlete or being a doctor or this and other. There should be rewards for that extra effort. In communist societies, where everybody, regardless of whether you're a cleaner or whether you're this, right, there's nothing wrong with any of those jobs. But the thing is, having a society where everyone is made to be equal stifles innovation, stifles creativity. And if you have any criticisms of that, with no free press, no anything, right, then you're trapped. And it doesn't matter whether like that prison that you're living in has excellent healthcare, has excellent education, has all these things, At the end of the day, if you cannot be whatever it is you want to be, if you can't strive to reach the heights that you want to, if you can't even criticize the state in which you live in, and you can't vote them out of office, well then what is the purpose in that? You literally, as we say, you're living in a gilded cage. This is something that we have to really think about, in the sense of, just because communism collapsed in the Eastern Bloc in the early 90s, these ideas are not going away. These ideas are still propagated by many people who criticize capitalism, who believe that the flaws in the system are so inherent that they need to be overthrown. But the thing is, I would urge a word of caution to that, because it's one thing to upend society, it's one thing to advocate revolution, but the word revolution comes from the word to revolve, i.e. to go in a circle. You overthrow the Tsar, you end up with a red Tsar. You overthrow the people in China, you end up with someone worse. You overthrow Batista, you end up with Castro, right? In all these cases, if you overthrow the system you had before and try to set up something new, before you know it, you will end up with much of the system that you had before, and all the power will be concentrated into the hands of a very small, ideologically fanatic group of people who have not learnt from the lessons of history, and they are either naive or arrogant enough to believe that how they would implement communism would be different from every other time. Yeah, they believe that they've learnt from the lessons of history, but the lessons of history show that actually it's not likely to happen. And another thing that many people who are communists fail to recognise is this: every single time a communist revolution has succeeded, it has been in a society that has been predominantly agricultural and not fully industrialised yet. In every single state that was industrialised enough, whether it's Germany, Italy, Spain, Chile, etc., etc., when you try to implement communism, the bourgeoisie within that state have enough strength, and there's enough people in there who have private property, who have a vested interest in maintaining in maintaining the kind of capitalist society, that actually, if you push them to that extreme, they will push the other way in the opposite extreme. And this is how you get the rise of fascism. So in developed, industrialized capitalist nations, if you try to implement communism, if there's a rise in communism, it has always had the equal and opposite rise of fascism in its place. And so those who advocate for communist revolution within Britain or America have to recognize that the lessons of history is that anytime this has been tried to be implemented in a developed country, it's always led to the rise of fascism. And this is something that we have to be very wary of, and it's also something we're going to talk about in the next video. This is me wrapping up with the section on communism. There are obviously some benefits to it. There is the focus of helping those who are least fortunate. At the same time, there's a lot of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of criticism of the inherent problems with capitalism, but many of the solutions end up being worse than the cure. And so this is something that we always have to bear in mind, that within a liberal democratic society, people can and should be free to exercise their views and to believe in whatever it is they want to within the market or place of ideas. But in reality, communism goes against the very nature of that liberal democracy. It cannot exist within the confines of that society. It seeks to overthrow that. And if you're going to overthrow the system which has provided the most freedom, the most economic prosperity, and the best standard of living for both rich and poor out of any system that has ever existed, you're going to have to be very, very careful that if you are to implement communism, that somehow this time it's going to be different.